Good morning and welcome to this session. My name is Errol Kekic and I'm a Senior Vice President at Church World Service. We're now being joined with folks on Facebook Live, and I wish to extend welcome to everybody who took the time to join us today. We have a distinguished panel of speakers, and I very much look forward to hearing their perspectives on the subject of matter. And as you know, we're trying to focus today on some new and some existing solutions for those who have been forcibly displaced in the globe. Today, we have Dr. Miriam Feldblum, the co-founder and the executive director of the President's Alliance on Higher Education and Immigration. Lizzie Boydell, private sponsorship program director at the International Refugee Assistance Project. Anna Gecht, who is a senior complementary pathways officer in the Division of International Protection at UNHCR. Laura Wagner, who is a project manager for the initiative on U.S. education pathways for refugee students at President's Alliance, and Oscar Bahati, who is a refugee student leader at the President's Alliance. I trust that you will enjoy their presentations today. My job is to try to set the stage for a conversation and then facilitate the conversation as it goes forward. There will be an opportunity for all of you to ask questions, and we encourage you to use your Q&A function at the bottom of your screen and or the chat function. We will try to get to all of those questions if the time allows. And in order to move this forward, we will start without much delay. Firstly, 70 years into the existence of the UN Refugee Agency, the unfortunate reality is the world has not become a much more peaceful place. The global humanitarian and refugee protection system continues to experience serious challenges to its implementation, and we continue to struggle collectively to find a solution for a number of situations around the globe that push people into displacement. The estimated number of people who are in need of resettlement as a durable solution at this point in time, according to UNHCR, is at about 1.47 million refugees. Not very many of those are very likely to be resettled in any given year. The ongoing conflict, coupled with climate change and the global pandemic, continues to put any and all of these operations of finding solutions in jeopardy. However, there are some significant, very innovative and exciting developments that have given those of us who are immersed in this work hope that if we continue to work hard and together, that there might be opportunities for all of us collectively to find additional ways of helping each other and those who are in need of assistance. One of those innovative solutions is certainly a 3-year strategy on resettlement and complementary pathways, which is a strategy developed by the UN Refugee Agency in collaboration with its stakeholders around the globe. And it has been in existence now for some time, and I'd be very excited to hear today from our colleagues at UNHCR, Anna Gecht in particular, about the ways in which this new solution or set of solutions has really worked over the last period of time, opening potential solutions for people who are considered for protection, not just because of their perceived vulnerability, but also because of their capacity that they bring as individuals. And apart from resettlement, the complementary pathways, as we will here focus on opportunities for employment, for education, and family reunification. We will also hear about the changes that were made possible thanks to the political changes in the largest country that does resettlement in the world, the United States. And we will look forward to hearing about how the academic institutions and higher education sector in this country is looking to partner with other mechanisms in the protection world to assist a larger number of refugee students and connecting them to potential educational opportunities in the future. We will also hear about how the private sponsorship initiatives that have been for years championed by some countries, including Canada, but also the United States in some ways, are coming to the forefront at the moment because partially of the Afghan refugee crisis that we're in the middle of at this point in time, and also because we are finally at the place where we realize that more opportunities are needed and no system alone can handle the need that exists out there for protection. So without further ado, I will turn this over to our distinguished panel, and I will invite Anna Geck from UNHCR to offer a brief overview of the implementation of the 3-year strategy on resettlement and complementary pathways. Anna, over to you.
Thank you so much, Errol. Just give me a second to get the presentation going. Please do let me know if you can see it.
We can see it, thank you.
Excellent. So thank you so much for having me here. I shall spend a little bit of time going, as URL had mentioned, the overview of the complement of the 3-year strategy on resettlement and complementary pathways, a little bit setting the stage, defining some of the key concepts that were highlighted in the strategy that is a commission, so to speak, of the Global Compact on Refugees. And now many of you will have known that there's also discussions on the extension of the strategy, of the future of the strategy, what that should look like. And if you haven't been part of these discussions, I would very much invite you to reach out to us to become a part of it. I should also say that the strategy was very much a global effort. Yes, UNHCR was in the drafting seat. However, it was really done at the with the huge input and a lot of consultation of various actors, states, NGOs, academia, and so on. So today, like I said, I will walk us through for some of the definitional components that we have been working since the strategy's release as they apply to third country solutions, and then focus a bit on the complementary pathways deliverables of the strategy thus far. Of course, we are in the reality of a global pandemic still, but interestingly enough, the effects of it have not necessarily been as drastic as we would imagine on pathways as such. And then speak to some of the achievements in the realm of pathways at the end of the presentation. We're happy to answer any questions and follow up. So starting with definitions, I thought it would be very important to underline what the strategy envisions as the definition of resettlement. So resettlement is something that we are quite used to being one of the durable solutions that UNHCR traditionally refers to. We have voluntary repatriation, we have local integration, and we have resettlement. I think we all know, and Errol had already alluded to it, that resettlement is available to very few based on specific protection and vulnerability criteria that are spelled out in UNHCR resettlement handbook. I think it's no secret to all that it is typically guided by state quotas, so the need for resettlement is usually matched against the available slots. What I would like to stress here is that for the purposes of complementary pathways, resettlement needs to be understood a bit in a more narrow fashion, meaning as a UNHCR referred process. In countries such as US and Canada, resettlement often as a term implies other means of getting into the countries for refugees based on other criteria. For the purposes of definitions of complementary pathways, which is another huge umbrella term, I would very much invite us all to retain that understanding that resettlement is something that is based on vulnerability protection criteria available to very few, who are identified and referred by UNHCR. As opposed, on your left, you will see the definition of complementary pathways, which I'm leading next to, which is safe and regulated avenues for refugees that complement resettlement, and that's a key aspect here, that provide lawful stay in a third country where international protection needs of the individuals who benefit from it are fully met. So complementary resettlement is key here, like I mentioned, because it sets out the identification methodology. When you speak of resettlement, you speak of protection needs and vulnerability, and you speak of UNHCR referral. Complementary pathways exist outside of that realm. They exist outside of the resettlement quotas as such, and they allow for individuals who are in need of international protection, but whose protection needs maybe are not as dire as those who qualify for resettlement. However, they have other qualifications that make them eligible for complementary pathways programs, such as somebody who happens to be a person in need of international protection, whether officially recognized or not as a refugee, who is a brilliant student and is trying to get to another country to expand his or her education, and then through that education, ideally find a solution as such. Similar approach to somebody who is a qualified professional in his or her field and is looking for a labor type opportunity. Family reunification, where you have the trigger for that movement or the identification piece here is that family relationship in the first place. So that's kind of a defining threshold of how we look at resettlement, and then everything else on top of it that does form third country solutions, however, will lead to third country solutions, however, is different in that methodology for identification. Now, second piece here, which you see highlighted, is lawful stay. So we're looking at opportunities that are legal, of course, and provide legal entry into the country where international protection needs are met, meaning that it's not just an entry, but there's that progressive access to a solution that is provided through the program, where an individual comes in, for example, as a student, and that is given an opportunity to stay either through asylum or more migratory type of framework by finding a job, by getting a permanent residency, and then eventually naturalizing into the country through other means, or like I said, applying for asylum and then getting residency, permanent residency and protection safeguards through that. What we're trying to do with pathways, essentially, is look at mechanisms that exist already for foreigners to come into various countries and make sure that these mechanisms are fully accessible and non-discriminatory for those who happen to be in need of international protection, while ensuring that they could also lead to that bridge to a solution, to a durable solution and a protection status going forward. So these are key considerations, key components that separate resettlement from complementary pathways, or rather define a program as a complementary pathway. It's a legal admission avenue. It's additional and separate to UNHCR referred resettlement against state quotas. Eligibility, like I said, is based on criteria not related to vulnerability or protection as such, or if they are, and this is humanitarian admission programs, protection needs are less imminent than those that qualify an individual for resettlement, and they should allow for the progressive access to a permanent durable solution through various means that exist out there. I've mentioned many already, and the plethora of complementary pathways is very much diverse. So we certainly have education, we have sponsorship, we have private sponsorship, there's a term called community sponsorship. I think that we've spent quite a bit of time recently trying to clean up the definitions to make sure that we understand, by naming a certain term, we understand it in the same manner. Particularly important in this realm is, of course, the division between resettlement and complementary pathways and the definition of pathways as such, but also the distinctions between sponsorship, private sponsorship, community sponsorship, name sponsorship, and so on. Because we certainly see in Europe a huge number of different programs that do have that term in their name. However, they oftentimes are integration programs for UNHCR referred resettled refugees, as opposed to a separate naming stream where a program would qualify as a pathway. For example, in Canada, you have a program by WUSC, World University Services in Canada, that does work on the basis of the sponsorship model that's available in the Canadian legislation. However, the identification piece, the reason for people being able to access that program is completely educational, has nothing to do with their vulnerabilities. So that's kind of an example of how these two function separately. And then for the naming programs that are not related to educational labor, and in Canada, there's actually quite a big number of those options, well, at least 3. Australia has another one where the naming piece, the identification piece, is again separate from resettlement criteria and resettlement quota that exist. And those we try to label as private sponsorship programs, so the naming programs, or named sponsorship programs, so that we really keep that distinction very well defined. Before you see the different typologies of pathways as we look at them, hold on just one second.
These things do happen, people.
I'm sorry. So what we also spent some time in the last year or so is trying to identify different typology of pathways in different groups. And it's very important for us to separate here the rights-based, dependency-based pathways, as opposed, rather third countries admission or third country solution programs. So the rights-based ones are very much family reunification, because that type of pathway is not based on a discretionary decision of a program actor, so to speak. However, as in contrast to that, it's based on an integral human right to family unity, and that is guided by international law. Hence, that program and those programs sit quite separately from the rest. Then you will see needs-based, and this is where protection needs play the most important role, and that's refugee resettlement and humanitarian admissions, humanitarian pathways. And then qualifications or relationship-based, that's education, employment, and private or nominated sponsorship, as I had mentioned. Going forward, just a few words about where we are right now. So the strategy had set a goal of ensuring that 1 million people are resettled in 10 years. Yes, it's a 3-year strategy with a 10-year goal. And 2.1 million people arrive in various countries on complementary pathways programs. So goal 1 of the strategy is increase resettlement, goal 2, enhance access and availability of complementary pathways, and goal 3, promote inclusive societies, which is essentially the framework for integration and reception of individuals who come through both resettlement and complementary pathways, and those who seek asylum sort of outside of the third country solution beyond reception. That's the breakout of the goals. So for 2021, we were supposed to see 160,000 people arriving on complementary pathways on their own, as opposed to 2020, which was 140,000 people. A few figures that we do have, and I have to be quite honest, the data on achieving these solutions on complementary pathways is still work in progress, because of the way of the statistical systems kind of being created. So the only report, and it's an indicative report, an indicative study that has been commissioned or done by us at UNHCR in collaboration with OECD, is before you. It's called Safe Pathways for Refugees. It's now a 3rd edition of that study that started with 10 to 18 coverage, and now the latest edition has come out just recently, covering 2020, not yet 2021. So for 2019, we see that we have 120,000 persons who had achieved complementary pathways or rather, who had gotten first-time permits in their country, in OECD countries in 2019, We have 1.5 million people who have arrived in OECD countries and Brazil in the course of the 10 years that the report covers. In 2019, 156,000 have arrived on their own. And you have, what's very important is that the resettlement and complementary pathway strategy has set up a ratio of 2.5 versus 1, meaning 2.5 people, 2 to 1 for complementary pathways versus resettlement. In reality now, at least up to 2019, which doesn't cover 2020, which is a COVID-affected year, the ratio is actually 2.5 versus 1, as opposed to pathways to resettlement. And when we speak of pathways, this report looks at first-time issued permits for family unification study programs and labor mobility, not humanitarian admission, not private named sponsorship. And it's also limited in scope to the countries that are members of OECD and Brazil, with a few exceptions there. So it's a glimpse, but it's not a full indication of where we stand right now. Just in terms of understanding what makes up most of them, family permits are over 1 million, so roughly 70% of what we have for the 10 years. And then student is about 18, with labor mobility roughly 13% of the total here represented. So family reunification remains the most relied upon pathway that surpasses resettlement, labor mobility, or education for the time being, at least according to the data that we have. In terms of programs, in the last couple of years, WUSCO in Canada is probably the oldest one, not probably, definitely the oldest education program known, but we have really seen many different programs coming up. Before you, you have a list of those that are on education exclusively. Some are a little older than others. We see a lot of interest and upsurge in programs in Europe recently. UNHCR has also increased its staffing capacity to ensure that support for these programs is being provided from our side. The latest of these is Univer in France, which is about to launch in the next year, most likely. In addition to that, we have programs such as EMPP on labor mobility in Canada, similar programs in the UK and Australia to offer labor mobility on humanitarian admissions. Italy has played a huge role, but also there have been other countries coming up and stepping up in offering solutions through humanitarian admissions in the recent past. We at UNHCR have also issued or released rather an opportunities portal, which primarily focuses for the time being on assisting those who look for in-country and third-country education opportunities to find these opportunities and make sure that the opportunities they get are fully verified and legitimate. And now we're working on the second reiteration of the site that will also feature labor-related components. Additionally to that, we've released, well, it's been in existence for some time, but we're working on the revision of what's called help.unhcr.org, and that's a compilation of family reunification type procedures, referral agencies, and support structures that are of relevance to refugees globally. Last but not least, a 3-year strategy calls upon networks and groupings and working groups to be developed. Of course, ATCR and better consultations on resettlement and now complementary pathways being kind of the biggest of them all. But in the last couple of years, we were successful in launching the Global Task Force on Education Complementary Pathways, which is meeting rather regularly. Now we have about 18 members there, including 3 states, and the work on standardizing approaches to complementary pathways, ensuring relevant guidance and support is available through that task force, as well as the expansion of the task force itself, is ongoing. Global Family Unification Network is another one that is now managed through a secretariat at UNHCR. I should mention that the Task Force on Education is now co-chaired by World University Services of Canada and Open Society University Network for the time being, and it has a separate secretariat to it. And now the government of Canada has committed to launching the Global Task Force on Refugee Labour Mobility, which should be coming up rather quickly. And that's another forum that is meant to really gather various interested parties to promote in real terms access to labour mobility as a complementary pathways. I will stop with this. Thank you so much. And apologies for the dog being very active. I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Many thanks indeed, Anna, for that presentation. Offered a lot of data and a lot of information, and I'm certain that we will get a lot of questions at the end of this process. In the interest of time, and we've just been informed that the time has been shortened by a portion of it, we're going to move to the next speaker. Lizzie, you have been working on private sponsorship initiatives for some time now. Would you be able to tell us about your work, and how has the Afghan crisis accelerated some of the aspects of your work?
Absolutely. So as Anna just noted in great detail, the definitions around a lot of this work are a little bit fuzzy, both in the United States and internationally. In the US, there's no really formal, completely agreed upon consensus definition of the various forms of sponsorship, and particularly private sponsorship, although a private sponsorship program for refugees has existed in the past, and there currently are many forms of community sponsorship across the United States, including co-sponsorship. So generally, when we talk about private sponsorship in the United States as a concept, as something that's existed in the past and we hope will exist again in the future, we're talking about something that exists to some degree outside of the existing resettlement structures that are government contracted with resettlement agencies, and that existing government-run reception and placement program for refugees, something that is offering communities, organizations, institutions, companies, interest groups the opportunity to more directly engage in refugee resettlement, as opposed to just volunteering or donating money, really directly engaging in it. And harnessing the financial and logistical resources of the private sector for individual refugee cases. We're talking about something that is really, as we've been describing, a complementary pathway, meaning a pathway that is complementary to, rather than part of, the traditional government-led refugee resettlement that so many of my organization's clients come through, that so many of the folks that other organizations on this call work with come through. That said, as I mentioned, we already have a number of forms of community sponsorship in the United States, meaning partnerships between folks in a local community, whether that's a more formal sponsor group or not, and the existing infrastructure, usually a local resettlement agency's affiliate office, in which those sponsor groups or volunteers work with a local refugee resettlement affiliate office to take on some of the financial and or logistical responsibilities of a resettled refugee case. So for example, a sponsorship group might raise a certain amount of money towards the cost of a refugee family's resettlement expenses, or they might help find housing, or they might work with the resettlement agency to help connect the family to school and work and language courses, or all of the above. And the sponsored refugee in that case comes from the existing pipeline of cases and would otherwise be resettled by the resettlement agency alone. It's coming through that existing pipeline rather than being a sort of separate immigration pathway or complementary pathway. That exists in a lot of locations around the United States, has recently been scaled up quite a bit, and is an important component of US refugee resettlement and our system writ large. It's also something that, although it may not necessarily expand the number of refugees who are able to come to the United States through a safe pathway every year more directly, is able to increase the system's capacity overall, all of the resources, financial, logistical, human, that are in the system, and able to, to be part of that welcome for individuals and families who are coming to the United States. Those existing forms of sponsorship are something we want to draw on, build on, as we advocate for a private sponsorship program that is fully complementary to our existing refugee resettlement scheme. There has been, as I noted, in the past, a private sponsorship program in the United States in the 1980s. It ended in the mid-90s. But more recently, there's been an increased interest in private sponsorship and other forms of community sponsorship for a number of reasons, some a little more theoretical and some very concrete. So some of the discussion is around how we involve more of the community in a refugee resettlement experience. And that's something that a lot of resettlement agencies, local offices around the US have already done, are already doing, but how do we do that at a bigger scale? And how do we parlay that into more capacity in the system and more opportunity to get people the safety in the system? There are also interest in forms of sponsorship, as a way of building those connections between local communities and refugees in order to, develop more understanding of what refugee resettlement is, of what safe pathways to the United States or other countries are, to bring a broader swath of communities into the welcome process and create a better narrative, I think, around local welcome of these folks, of national welcome of these folks, as opposed to something that's happening at a distance from us, thinking about it as something that's happening with us very directly, that we have a responsibility as existing members of a community to folks who are going to come into our community. So creating a constituency that is supportive of refugee resettlement because it's involved in refugee resettlement. There's also, as I noted, this interest in increasing the capacity of the system and the numbers in the system. I think something that we've strongly advocated for, and a lot of folks who work in this space would agree with, is the concept of additionality, which is drawn from the Canadian model, meaning that refugees who come through a private sponsorship program, a program that's fully complementary to the existing resettlement infrastructure, would be a number above and beyond the number that the US government is going to resettle that year. So if the US government commits to resettling, say, 125,000 refugees, that perhaps then we could have an additional 10,000 refugees who are able to come to the United States safely through private sponsorship. As Anna noted, you may have slightly different definitions and eligibilities here. We would still be talking about folks who meet the US definition of refugee, but the program might broaden access to who can reach safety in the United States. So it might allow for reunification of a broader variety of family members if people were allowed to name the refugee case they want to bring over. It might allow for nomination of refugees who are hesitant for various reasons to present themselves to UNHCR or to embassies abroad, but could be nominated by folks here. There are interesting possibilities around the alignment or experience of certain interests between potential sponsors and potential sponsee refugees. We've seen in Canada the flourishing of what they call rainbow groups, meaning LGBTQI+ groups that are focused on resettling or privately sponsoring LGBTQI+ refugees, and have a unique set of background experience and familiarity that can especially enable them to provide a supporting and welcoming environment to folks who have particular vulnerabilities when they arrive. There are interesting opportunities to innovate, to explore how we might improve refugee resettlement experiences writ large, utilizing a newer program that has strong monitoring and evaluation. And so, you can see there are a lot of interesting possibilities and a lot of driving factors here. Beyond that kind of more theoretical discussion, I think we have some more pressing concrete concerns that have motivated interest in sponsorship and really pushed this conversation along over the past few months. I think everyone on this call probably is familiar with the situation created by the US withdrawal from Afghanistan in late summer 2021, which has led to over 100,000 Afghan humanitarian parolees who are either in the United States or en route to the United States, will be arriving shortly, folks who were been forcibly displaced from their home country of Afghanistan for a variety of reasons, some due to having worked with the United States, others for other factors that put them at risk, and are being paroled into the United States, meaning that they're given a temporary status through which they're able to come to the United States and will be able to apply for asylum or potentially, if legislation is passed, to adjust status eventually. And those folks, a very large number of them, are arriving, have now been made eligible through an act of Congress for basically the equivalent benefits that refugees receive when they arrive through our traditional U.S. refugee admissions program infrastructure. But it's a challenge to place so many folks in communities and give them high quality experiences when the resettlement infrastructure is still trying to rebuild itself after years of being reduced and low refugee admissions under the Trump administration. So a question, for this moment has been, how can we utilize the, unique capacity and really an outpouring of interest from local communities all over the country, a whole variety and a spectrum of places and affiliations, to increase our capacity and more quickly, efficiently move these Afghan humanitarian parolees off of their temporary housing situation on US military bases and into the communities where they are eventually going to be integrated and thrive and they apply for asylum and be on a pathway to US citizenship. And that has led to a few recent innovations. One, a program called the Sponsor Circle Program for Afghans, a program which shares a lot of similarities to what a private sponsorship program might ultimately look like, but is being operated specifically to relocate folks who have already entered the United States as Afghan humanitarian parolees into programs into locations around the country, in which sponsor groups of individuals, local organizations have come together, have raised funds, have developed a plan to welcome them, have received training, and are then matched with them to support their initial few months of placement in a U.S. community. There's also been a scaling up of co-sponsorship, I mentioned earlier in this presentation, of partnerships between refugee resettlement agencies and local co-sponsors, or in this case, sometimes national level organizations that are able to provide a network of co-sponsors in order to increase the capacity, logistical, financial, otherwise, to take on these cases in an efficient manner. And it's not just a question of money, because the U.S. government has financed a lot of this, but it's also a question of the types of resources and supports that can be a little bit more in short supply. So everything from finding affordable housing and employment opportunities to having that very individualized, localized support of taking folks to their doctor's appointments and helping children get registered for school. So I think there's been a lot of interest in sponsorship and its various forms to kind of meet this moment, meet this challenge. As we look at the ways in which sponsorship is being utilized to help meet that moment, we're also looking at, how we can take those innovations and those learnings and apply them to something that is a broader and more permanent program. So in February 2021, earlier this year, the president issued an executive order on refugee resettlement that included a direction to the Department of State and other agencies to look at what expanded community sponsorship, inclusive of a private sponsorship pilot, might look like. In summer 2021, the Department of State delivered that initial report to the White House. And this fall, in the report to Congress, which is a document in which the president lays out his plans or her plans for refugee resettlement for the coming fiscal year, the president and the agencies indicated an early 2022 launch for a private sponsorship pilot program. Private sponsorship as a complementary pathway to the traditional resettlement infrastructure, hopefully with additionality, as we discussed, and available to a broader spectrum of folks beyond this initial Afghan humanitarian parole population that we're looking to assist with some of the co-sponsorship and sponsor circle opportunities I mentioned. And over the past few months, and I think going into the next few months, we'll be looking at how forms of community sponsorship can, as I said, not just meet the moment, but become, more deeply embedded in our overall refugee resettlement and humanitarian immigration system in the United States, in order to, as Errol, described at the beginning of this call today, try to meet the really significant global need that we see for safe pathways for forcibly displaced people, and to at the same time really harness the interest and resources of communities around the country. So I will leave it off there.
Thank you so much, Lizzie. You have been a leader in the process of crafting these new innovative solutions in this country and beyond, and we're certainly thankful for that process. Look forward to questions that I'm sure will be coming up right after we finish with our speakers. It is my great pleasure now to turn it over to Miriam Feldblum, who has been now leading a very important initiative that you've touched on, Lizzie, to open up higher education opportunities for refugee students. Without further ado, I'll turn it over to Miriam.
Thank you so much, Errol and PNA, Nick, CWS, for this opportunity to join you today and to share with you our work on the initiative to increase U.S. education pathways for refugee students. As Errol said, my name is Miriam Feldblum, and I'm the Executive Director of the President's Alliance on Higher Education and Immigration. I'm going to start us off quickly to set the context, say a few words about the President's Alliance, and then my colleague, Oscar Bahadi, who is himself a former refugee student with extensive experience in building educational opportunities for refugee youth, will speak. Oscar came to the President's Alliance this past summer and is a project associate on the initiative and organized workshops with current and former refugee students to ensure that our work and recommendations were student-centered and informed by refugee students' experiences and insights. Then my colleague Laura Wagner is going to go into more depth about the work and recommendations and share the highlights of the upcoming report. Laura also came to the President's Alliance in the summer to serve as the initiative's project manager. Laura has extensive experience in the refugee resettlement work as a senior program officer for integration at LIRS, as well as expertise in international education. So to start, the President's Alliance, which was founded in late 2017, is now comprised of over 500 presidents and chancellors of US public and private colleges and universities who've come together to support undocumented immigrant, refugee, and international students, and advocate alongside them for increased higher education access and equity, and for fair, forward-looking, and common sense immigration reform. The President's Alliance is singularly and comprehensively focused on the intersection of higher education and immigration. And with all the work that we've done over the past few years, our members are now ready to organize and mobilize when a new issue or opportunity arises. And that's the case here. The overarching vision of our initiative is to significantly increase refugee student entry and access to the United States and US higher education. In the US, as Lizzie and others have outlined, we're now in a pivotal moment with the administration indicating that they're primed to launch private sponsorship initiatives, including in the future enabling universities to sponsor refugee students who are overseas, so that these refugee students can come to study on campuses across the US. The administration also appears to be willing to consider how the existing international student F1 visa system, and Anna referred to kind of student visas as another way that refugee students can gain access to safe refuge, can better accommodate refugee students who seek to apply to higher ed institutions in the US. Now, to get into the substance of the initiative's work and recommendations, let me turn to my colleague Oscar to start us off. Oscar.
Thank you, Miriam. As Miriam introduced myself, my name is Oscar Bat. I'm working as a project associate on the initiative for US education pathway for refugee students. So I'm originally from the Democratic Republic of Congo, in the part of Eastern Kivu, and also I was a refugee in Rwanda, where I spent more than 2 decades in a refugee camp. Within the same camp, I founded and managed a high school to support refugee students who were dropping their studies at middle school. So I earned my bachelor's from National University of Rwanda, and also I earned my second and my MBA from Southern National University. During my academic journey, I faced so many challenges, such as tuition fees, covering the travel cost to come here in the US for studies, as well as the visa cost. So I'm thinking that the universal sponsorship will change the lives of many refugees, and also will increase the life of many families where students are coming from, and as well as increase the sense of inclusivity on campuses, as well as helping or producing skilled laborers to the job market. So my job with the universal sponsorship or with the President's Alliance, making sure that this program is centered for refugee students. So in the past, I was able to plan and co-facilitated design workshop where we had different objectives. The first objective was to test the science from the student perspective, and also to enable student leaders from refugee and non-refugee background to make sure that they can share their vision of the universal sponsorship. So the third one was to enrich our recommendation to stakeholders, and also make sure that we can have student stories and also testimonials to higher education institutions. So as a result of our workshop, we're able to include student voices in the report, and also we're able to collect student stories and testimonials that will be used for the education awareness. And also we are constantly communicating with students to make sure that they can be aware about with any step forward. So also lastly, we are currently making sure that we are working with student voice for refugees to make sure that we can spread the word to different colleges and universities around the country. So I will turn to my friend, my colleague Laura, to take us to the next section. Thank you.
Thank you, Oscar, and thank you so much, NPNA, for having us to present today about pathways for refugee students. I have been asked to share a little bit about the key recommendations that we're calling for in the forthcoming report to really try to build a complementary pathway for refugee students to access both higher ed as well as a legal permanent residence in the US. First, a little bit, as my colleagues talked about, the initiative has been working since May. It has been a compilation of 5 working groups, each in individual domains, and with a wide variety of participants, from refugee students, other students, humanitarian refugee resettlement professionals, philanthropic leaders, and folks from the higher ed community, all coming together in a grand generosity of spirit and expertise to kind of put their ideas to paper. And so we wrapped up the working groups in September, and over the past month, we have been finalizing the report. And the report is going to launch this Thursday. And so I am just going to give a brief overview of some of the recommendations, but you will be able to read the full report very soon. Mainly the report's recommendations are for the US government and policymakers, particularly the State Department, but there are also recommendations for donors as well as the US higher ed community in terms of how we can really build and implement this infrastructure. I'm gonna share my screen to show you a quick infographic while I explain the policy recommendations. Awesome. So the first and most significant recommendation is for the US government to create the policy infrastructure to enable university sponsorship program for refugee students. And so this is what Lizzie talked a lot about in terms of a P4 or a category that the Biden administration has said they intend to implement in pilot in 2022. What we are essentially asking for and saying is that colleges and universities should be included in that program and be able to nominate or identify students to be privately sponsored and resettled in the US. As part of that recommendation, we are also saying that sponsored students should be additional to government assisted refugees. In other words, they would not take the spots of refugees identified for resettlement based on vulnerability or protection needs. Also, as Miriam mentioned, we have included recommendations for revisions to the F1 visa. We know that university sponsorship will not provide access to everyone who needs it to US higher ed. And so we have recommendations on that. I'm going to stop sharing. Lastly, we have developed recommendations for the launch of a US-based implementing organization that would act as a bridge between refugee students overseas and US colleges and universities. The report goes into a lot of detail on how this implementing organization could and should operate, including developing a consolidated application process, how to identify and select students, and how to match students with the appropriate higher ed institution. We relied heavily on the expertise and experience of WUSC, which offers a similar model in Canada. Again, we have over 50 pages of recommendations that I am happy for you to read later this week. And we'll also be hosting a briefing on December 2nd that goes into the details of the report. And so we will share that information with you as well. But really, we are focused on building the policy and program infrastructure to be able to launch this, as well as spreading awareness through a response campaign so that the higher ed communities know and understand refugee sponsorship and what that could look like for universities. And so our big next step is to work with partners to build the infrastructure, and so that we are ready with that structure and funding and able to start recruiting students as soon as the policy is in place. So thank you so much, and I'm going to pass it back to Errol.
Thank you so much, Laura. That was really informative and helpful for the overall context. Congratulations on completing the report. We look forward to reading it in detail. Folks, we do have only a few minutes left since we have been notified that we need to end a few minutes early. So the first question that I have is for you, Lizzie. Your presentation about various forms of community sponsorship was really informative. And the question that is raised has to do with, would these opportunities be available for our neighbors south of the US border? And the sub-question of that, if the number of privately sponsored immigrants are not included in the overall refugee quotas, would they be in addition to?
Great questions. To start, I think that these opportunities, whether they're available to neighbors south of the US border, depends a bit on which form of community sponsorship we're talking about. So certainly if we do have a private sponsorship program, as the administration has indicated it plans to do, that program should be open to all nationalities, to displaced persons coming from all over the globe. And so cases from anywhere in the world, including cases south of the US border, could be nominated for private sponsorship and be able to come to the United States on a successful private sponsorship application. With regards to community sponsorship in its kind of existing forms, and sponsor circles. The sponsor circle program is specific to Afghan humanitarian parolees at the moment, but different forms of community sponsorship have been utilized for other types of cases. So co-sponsorship and community sponsorship have been used around the country at a variety of different resettlement agencies and their local affiliate offices for a pretty broad spectrum of cases that have come through the U.S. Refugee Resettlement Program. So if a case is coming from, say, Guatemala, or a case is coming from Afghanistan, or a case is coming from, let's say, Somalia, any of those countries, that a person might be displaced from or have fled to as a country of first asylum, any of those cases, if they are coming through the U.S. Refugee Resettlement Program, could be resettled utilizing a form of community sponsorship by the Refugee Resettlement Agency taking on the case and the community into which the case is being placed. One additional note there is that forms of community sponsorship or co-sponsorship have been translated in some cases over to non-refugee cases. In the sense that that model has been adapted to assist with asylum seeker cases or folks who come on other routes. So there have been instances in which a very similar kind of model has been utilized to assist cases that have come to the United States and sought asylum once here, as opposed to coming through the refugee admissions program. And I believe that in those instances, a lot of those cases have been folks who have come over the southern border. So the second part of the question about the numbers, our hope and our advocacy is aimed at having the number of privately sponsored refugees in a private sponsorship program to be established, hopefully this coming fiscal year, coming calendar year, I should say 2022, would be additional to the number of refugees to be resettled by the government. So the hope is that, the government says we're going to resettle X number of refugees this year, that we would then have an additional number to be coming to the United States through private sponsorship. The design of that program, however, is still to be determined.
Thank you, Lizzie, and I apologize for having to interrupt. We are running up against the end of our time together, and one of the questions we have received in the chat is where to find more information about all of this. Any good session ends with the request for more sessions. So if you wouldn't mind putting your organizational websites and or other links in the chat function, that would be great. I'm doing that with mine right now. And with that, I wanted to extend my personal and our collective thanks to our distinguished panel today. I trust that you have enjoyed listening to our speakers, and we certainly could spend 7 more hours just diving into details of what is going on around us at this point in time. Regretfully, we don't have the time to do it, but I certainly hope that this is not going to be the last session of this kind, and we thank everybody in the audience for being with us today. Thank you, MPNA, and over to you.
All right, thank you all so much for joining. And we have one more session in the series for the post-NIC virtual series. So stay tuned for that to your email. And I want to thank all of our wonderful panelists, Errol, for guiding us through this very important conversation. And we will be sending the recording. Have a great rest of your morning, afternoon. Goodbye.